Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm Dan Nadel, and I'm here to speak to Sammy Harkham. Sammy, as many of you know, is the author of the just-released Everything Together collected stories. Sammy is also the editor of Kramers Ergot, which is a long-running anthology, the 8th issue of which was published just last year around this time. He is also a prolific cartoonist. He has an ongoing comic book series called Crickets, and he is also the co-owner of the store Family in Los Angeles and the Cine Family, which is a repertory theater in LA as well. So welcome, Sammy Harkham. So I want to start a little sideways because, there's Sammy, by Sammy. Because over the summer, Sammy recommended a film to me called The Swimmer, based on the John Cheever story. It stars Burt Lancaster, and it's from 1967, 66. And I watched it and really enjoyed it. And while I was watching it and having just finished taking Sammy's book to print and working with Sammy for the last couple of years pretty closely, I thought it kind of captured a lot of what is important about your work. It contains all your interests, essentially: relationships, internal crises, kind of breathtaking beauty, and interior and natural opulence, the sort of forests and gorgeous interiors as this character, Burt Lancaster, has to swim. He decides to get home to his supposedly palatial house in Connecticut via his neighbor's swimming pools. And he hops from one to the next, swimming and talking, and things gradually occur until you get to the end, and no spoilers because it's a movie from the 60s. A sort of horror ensues at the end. And Sammy, I mean, your work contains all those things often in the same comic strip, but also individually. I mean, the great thing about Everything Together is it charts your sort of evolving emotional interests as a cartoonist. And it starts with sort of idyllic beauty and moves into horror and contains relationships and beauty and all these things all at once. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the tension between those emotions and also what you got out of The Swimmer.
Well, has anyone seen the movie? Has anyone here seen it?
One.
Yeah. Oh, God. Well, let's just talk about the movie, because that's a little bit easier than talking about my work. I think we can slowly get there, hopefully. But yeah, it was like, I watched the movie, and it's one of those things where I love this, and I try to do it in my own work, where it makes sense that he's in a bathing suit the whole time, and because it fits the plot of the story and what needs to happen. But of course, as the story goes on, and you start seeing him become more and more vulnerable, and you can start seeing through him more and more, you realize like that's actually the perfect like visualization of this person. And I watched it, and it was like totally hit me like a ton of bricks, and it stayed with me and stayed with me, and it's just this perfect. It's that thing. It's the movie's about. He says that Dan sort of made it sound like it becomes like a horror movie at the end. It's just more that it becomes heartbreakingly sad, because you realize that this character is he's in willful denial about his life. And I think we kind of live our lives, as I get older, I feel it more and more, this feeling of we live in willful ignorance, you know? It's like denial. I almost feel like everything I'm working on is always about denial. Like you could just title every story Denial. Because, you know, you kind of need to the only way you can move forward is to kind of not think about the reality of what you're doing, you know? Because it's too difficult and it's too depressing otherwise. So what was it you asked me about? Two things in that question? What was it?
I just wonder how you think it relates to your work. Because
I mean, so like, just talking about process a little bit. You know, I love it. I like it when you can have your sort of metaphorical or sort of poetic or sort of all the things that all the richer things, aspects of a piece, if you can sort of enfold it into a story so that you don't, it's not bringing attention to itself in any way. So that, this movie is a perfect example of that, and that's probably why I like it. And like, there's a scene, to speak of another movie, it's, everyone's probably seen The Searchers by John Ford. And there's many instances in that movie where characters are just doing what's logical in the scene, but it like also works as purely sort of spiritual or emotional elements that are sort of being pushed to the front, you know? And I like the kind of storytelling that's very straightforward, where someone doesn't signal or sort of showcase a particular moment above all else. I like things feeling like everything is treated equally, everything's drawn equally, everything's given almost the same amount of time, and it's the cumulative effect of something. And comics is one of those things where, regardless of what you're drawing in a scene, whether it's two people, you know, having drinks or a car crash, you kind of you need to like put, even though you may be more excited about drawing the car crash, because you've never drawn a car crash, and you're like, finally I get to do my Jeff Darrow moment, you know?
Right.
It's like you kind of have to pull back and draw it as casually and as relaxed as you did the two people sitting drinking, because you want it all to read consistent, and you sort of want to have this even, for me, narrative is like the most important thing, that you can just follow a story and just sort of let things slowly build, you know? And that movie is a really, really good example of that, I think. Well, you guys should all watch it. It's fantastic.
The Swimmer.
Yes.
That kind of brings us into the next thing, which is the story of, I think your first sort of really significant story, although Poor Sailor predates it, I think the sort of best of your earliest work is Somersaulting, which is in Everything Together. And it kind of exemplifies the beauty that I sort of associate with you, and also with The Swimmer, this sort of elegiac beauty and a sort of feeling of hazy remembrance.
Well, there's that thing of like nature being beautiful, but it also doesn't care about you, you know?
Yeah.
And nature's a great way. It's like, no matter what sort of internal turmoil you're having, the world just keeps going. And it's always existed, and it's gonna keep existing, you know? So like, for me, every time I draw like lots of foliage, it's kind of like, it's beautiful, but it's also like kind of scary.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But this was the first story where I was like, I was thinking, it's connected to what I was just saying before about how I like to write. This was the first time where I wanted to treat every moment the same. And I wanted to give everything the same sort of casual care, regardless if it was somebody, you know, going down on somebody, or somebody having cereal. Where I was like, because when you think of your teenage years, it's this weird, like it's odd, you know, what things you remember. And they're like, some of them are profound, and then some of them are just these really stupid details. But they're always at the forefront of your mind as you get older. And I was really inspired by Brian Chippendale's book with Ninja.
Really?
Ninja was coming out as a mini comic. And so Ninja is one of these comics, if you're unfamiliar with it, where it's these pages with like, what was the average panel page? It was like 40, 30?
No, but like 20 maybe.
20, okay. So 20 panels, small, and you just sort of follow these characters. And I remember there was one scene in particular. They were very dense pages, and occasionally they would open up. But you would just follow these characters through space. And I remember one time a character's walking, he runs into a guy, like a guy who looks like Skeletor from He-Man. He's holding a severed arm, and he says, "Whose arm is that?" He says, "It's the arm of my beloved." You know? And then the guy keeps walking. And I love that, like, he just, like, who knows what was going on in Brian's day? Who knows if the severed arm comes back into the story? But for me, at that moment, reading that, I was like, wow, it's such a great way of sort of, as Will calls it, demilitarizing drama.
Right.
right? Of melodrama, where it's like, I'm just giving this to you. I don't care if you find it, if like strings are playing in your head as you read it, you know, or if it feels mundane, you just like, these are just, the whole strip when working on it was like, these are like intangible things. Not one of these scenes to me is necessarily sad or funny. They're just weird scenes, you know, so it's, you just sort of want to treat them all the same. So when it first ran, it ran as a 9-panel grid. But because I was drawing each individual panel on its own.
No, was that
It was
by
large.
By Chester Brown?
The 9-panel grid?
No, the single panel on its own.
It was a good way for editing because I didn't know the order. I knew I had like, I basically spent maybe a couple months just keeping a sketchbook and just doing all these sort of semi-autobiographical strips. But I switched it to girls as I started doing that because it made it less autobiographical and made it more fiction, which is what you want. You know, you want to pull away from reality. And drawing at 1 panel a page, or the most is 4 panels a page, is that it gives you room to sort of move stuff, cut stuff. There were scenes that were cut from the comic, which of course when you're doing it, you're like, I'm not cutting a fucking thing. This shit takes so long. But of course, you know, you do try to find a rhythm, you know. So it was one of those things of just, I'm going to draw all these scenes, and some of them are just a drawing of the main character sitting in a tree, or it's going to be 2 girls wearing trash cans on their head and running into each other. And then longer moments and stuff. And then, you know, as you do that, a narrative starts to form because just naturally your mind can't help but make connections. And yeah, that was it. But then when we were doing the book, I didn't think it printed well because what happened was by trying to be like Brian Chippendale and sort of make everything very minor, it like, the work was shrunk so small that I feel like it didn't work because a lot of it's about all those, the drawings are like a particular style that I haven't really, I think it was the way I was drawing just for that strip. So 4 panels a page just seems like the way to go.
Right.
You know?
And what else, I mean, you have pretty Catholic tastes. So, I mean, what else was working on you at the time? I'm surprised by Chippendale. And who, I mean, obviously, your style is influenced by sort of classic cartooning.
This strip, like what was it inspired by? There was
yeah,
a
but
movie.
also your drawing style in general. And I think of Roy Crane.
I know, but you know, I'm not one of those guys that like redraws panels of other people. I always think I should.
Are there guys who do
Yeah, I feel like most cartoonists that I'm friends with, like, they study other people's work.
Right.
They'll redraw panels of little cartoonists. And I never really do it, and when I do it, I feel really self-conscious, so it's obviously not ever going to become part of my process. I know that the strip was definitely like me trying to take a bite at that genre, which for me is like really, I Never Liked You. Like that's the book, you know, that's still by Chester Brown. That's probably still one of my favorite books with the black gutters. The first printing of that book with the black, there's something about these panels coming out of the blackness that's really striking. But you know, he's got sequences in there where it's just him as a kid getting crackers out of a cupboard and then eating them. And you're like, what does this mean? You know? But you know, obviously Chester. As far as drawing, I think this is the first strip where I became very comfortable.
Oh.
I became very comfortable, and I drew the comic at a friend's kitchen table in Australia one summer. He let me use his kitchen as a studio. So his house sort of appears, and you know what? It was the photographs of Bill, the guy, he owns a beer magazine. He's really into beer. He did a book called Suburbia, a book of photographs of Bill Owens.
Oh yeah?
So Bill Owens, I started looking at a lot of photography initially for reference, but then that really, you start finding people like Stephen Shore, like the big names, like William Eggleston, Stephen Shore, and you start really I started getting really excited about spaces and like that panel, the bottom left panel where she's wearing like the Sesame Street mask. That's like one of my favorite panels because she's pointing her finger at her like a gun. She's kicking her. She's sitting on this weird couch. The shelving next to her and like this knitted rug on the wall. Like these were things that, I'm not saying they mean anything to anybody, but to me, it felt like these are the small revelations you have as a cartoonist, where all of a sudden like it's starting to feel right. I think you sort of spend a certain amount of time. It can be short or it can be long. Just trying to get what you see in your head down, and you sort of spend, for me it was like years of just doing terrible work and knowing it was terrible and not knowing how to make good work, and like knowing like I think I have good taste but I just don't know how to do this, you know. So like that panel was like one of those moments where I was like, oh, I think I can keep doing this,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, photography was a big influence, and then obviously always music.
Right.
Music. There's a song called Horses by Bonnie Prince Billy, where he's covering his own band, Palace, and he's playing with these session players from
the Nashville.
From the Nashville sessions. And he's got another song called West Palm Beach. And again, it's like songs where they're not really about much, but they have this feeling of like when you're like getting excited about nothing. And so I wanted there to be a certain energy about like how you get excited about nothing.
Right.
When you're a kid, you know, you're just sort of brimming with enthusiasm, and then you're like crying all night, and you don't know why.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, also taking off a bit on, you're describing that room in somersaulting, and one of the things that's happened over the last few years is you've become a sort of renderer of rooms. It's sort of a very strange transformation into sort of fantasy architecture.
You know what it was? All it comes down to is you...
Not these, wait. There, that.
Right, I like that drawing.
That.
Well, what happens is that you finally, like, you struggle for so long, and then you go like, you know what, instead of designing a chair, I'm gonna look in a book. And you go like, oh my God, there's something called like reference.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's a huge thing that opened up for me.
There's the internet too.
It's
world.
I'm not even joking, like I'm really not even being sarcastic. Like there was a moment where I was like, oh no, I have to draw a bus, inside of a bus. How do I do that? I better go take photos, and like all of a sudden it was like the 1920s in my mind, and I'm gonna have to sit and sketch for hours. But then so yeah, once I started really realizing like, oh, you know, I should just, when I see interesting things, interesting objects and spaces and things like that, I'll keep them. And it all came out of narrative, like doing a piece like that and starting to get interested in drawing spaces like that comes out of wanting the comics to be more and more specific. Like every story for me, and when I talk to other cartoonists and they tell me what they're working on, the first thing I want to know is like, what's the setting? Like I don't care who the characters are, I want to know like what city, you know, what year, you know, like I just want to know where, because that to me is like what's initially exciting about something.
Does it give you a specificity that exterior spaces, like nature, doesn't? Don't?
Well, I mean, nature, look, I think a lot of my earlier stuff has a lot of nature stuff because they were really just focused kind of fable type comics where you just want to like focus on a character moving through space. But then once you have to start making decisions about, okay, this person drives a car, you're like, well, what kind of person are they? You know, and then you think about how that car can really express something about the world they live in and the kind of person they are, and then you think what kind of art they have, and you know, I think those are interesting things to play with. And then as an artist, you want to keep things visually interesting, because for the most part, like I've done a horror comic and I've done little bits of genre-like things, but I'm really just interested in like people. I like settings where it's just like, you know, like that strip, the New Yorker story, it's kind of like that. And so you want to try to keep things visually interesting. So then you go, okay, well, I know this scene I want to do takes place in a restaurant. And you're like, well, what would be an interesting restaurant for the reader to look at while this is playing out?
Right. And
then hopefully, as you sort of figure out where it's going to take place, and you're like, oh, it's going to be like it'll be in like a tacky sushi restaurant where it's all like, feels like you're outdoors, but you're really inside, and it's all this stuff. And then you think, well, what visually can be happening around it, and that can help the narrative and affect the narrative, and then it starts building nicely so that the setting is really affecting the story, and you know what I mean? And it's so for me, it's
does it have anything to do with living in LA? Because I always think of LA as sort of being very much, I mean, despite obviously the landscape, whenever I go to LA, I spend a lot of time inside, and there are always really interesting spaces I mean, it's a place with great houses.
That's
to
true.
Sort of wander
That's true.
through.
LA is interesting because there's no set style,
No.
right? So like everyone kind of like, because it's basically the first 100 years of LA is people moving there from other places.
Right.
So everyone's building the house of their youth.
Yeah.
You know, or like developing the neighborhoods of their youth. Like, oh, I grew up on a golf course. Like my father had a golf course, so I'm gonna make a whole area that looks like a golf course. And this part of town looks like Spain, and this part of town looks like France.
Right. Right.
You know, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm in the thick of it. I don't know. You know, I don't know. Any answer I give you is gonna be some bullshit off the cuff thing.
And then there are these that I think of as these sort of horror interiors.
Horror.
Yeah.
They're rooms I want to live in.
Really?
I really like that room.
Yeah.
But, you know, I like, I mean, there's this thing like,
menacing though.
I guess what it is that with comics, one thing that's always happening is that things always feel like they're moving. There's like this ebullience to everything, just because they're cartoon characters.
Right.
So I feel like for a long time I was trying to find, like, how do you do something that isn't like bouncing with the artist's personality and hand, like, you know, but I'm not Chris Ware, I have this ultimate control over my line. I'm not Charles Burns or you Suarte or something. So, you know, with spaces, I feel like I can draw the space. I use a uniform line because every time I draw with a brush, I feel like I'm screaming or that I have a tambourine in my hand. Like, there's something about it that just feels so like, ugh, it just feels really distasteful. So the uniform line sort of keeps it mellow, and then the space, and just, I like these opulent rooms, and then just some sort of movement or something that's sort of playing with it, you know?
Yeah. That's another one. And that, I wanted to ask you about your relationship.
Sorry if this is boring, guys. I'm trying not to be boring. I'm sorry.
I'm bored. Terrible. I want to ask you about Will Oldham because you've done a bunch of covers for him, and of course he blurbed your book. And just curious about your relationship. I mean, creatively, but also just as a sort of being friends with an older artist who you're also simpatico with. It
Right.
can be very important.
I was lucky in that I met him when I was 16. He's 10 years older than me, so he was 26. And I interviewed him for the Kramers Ergot zine, Kramers Ergot #1, right? And he treated me like shit. He just made fun of me, took none of my questions seriously, my stupid questions. You could imagine the questions, but once, as soon as we turned off the tape recorder, he was super friendly, and then we hung out for like 2 hours at the back of this club, and his music, and then I sent him the zine when it was done, and then he called me. He called me on the phone like super early one morning. I was like, this is bizarre. You know, I was in high school, and he asked me to do all the drawings for this. He said, I'm now going to be making records under this name, Bonnie Prince Billy. And I just kept thinking of like Bonnie Raitt. Like, I kept thinking it's a girl's name, Bonnie. I hadn't heard of Bonnie Prince Charles or anything, so I was just like, Bonnie? That's so weird, you know? So he wanted me to do drawings for his record, and at that point, you know, he had made, his music was a huge, huge influence on me. It was like him, Leonard Cohen, Newt Hampson. There were like certain things that had really, I just responded to intensely. So he was probably like my favorite musician. You know, when you're younger, I mean, you know, everyone knows, it's like you have those 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, those records that you sit at your desk and you work at, and you have your record player next to you, and you just play them. Like forever. You play them for like 2 years, you know? So he had records that were like that did that to me. And then the relationship, he turned out to be like one of the most interesting people I'd ever met, you know? Like genuinely helpful, and he's like, in many ways he was like a big brother or something, you know? And so as an artist, he's somebody who, he's like, he does not do anything by status quo. Even within his industry, any sort of business decision, creative decision, He doesn't give. He does what he thinks he needs to do. You know, things that keep him interested and engaged. You know, and so those were really good lessons. Those are really good lessons to have. You know, and I remember like talking to him when I was like. I was like saying, I think I'm gonna go work in animation, and I think I'm gonna get a job doing this. And he was just like, don't do that. You know, like, but I just needed somebody to say, like, he's like, you got to, he gave me very good advice. I'm not going to go into necessarily the specifics of it, but he's somebody who's always been a big influence and a good sort of mentor about life. Because he's somebody who, he's an antagonizing kind of force with people and within certain communities, but he has like immense enthusiasm and love of people. And I think that's an important thing to hold on to as you get older.
Right.
Yeah. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
You know.
I'm going to change the subject entirely now. We're going to swerve.
This is called getting married, this drawing. Where like all of a sudden like you just have sex and you're like, whoa, like I feel free. Like this is crazy.
I wanted to ask you about horror because it's a longtime interest of yours, and I mean I know you were a longtime Fangoria fan.
Yeah.
And you've made a lot of work about it. I mean, Poor Sailor sort of has its moments, and Terror House, a zine you did last year, is full of it. You made a film recently, a short film of face melting.
We should watch that.
I don't have it here.
Oh, that's a shame, man. I have it on my phone. Each one of you can come over, we can watch it. Yeah.
So, you know, where did that start?
I grew up with two older brothers.
Yeah.
And one of them's 5 years older than me, one of them's 8 years older than me. And so, and I have a bunch of younger siblings. So my parents didn't really monitor what was going on in the house ever. It's very difficult. So when I was like 5, 6 years old, you'd watch stuff like The Exorcist, because it would be on, or The Shining, you know? So like, I remember seeing Toxic Avenger, and like, I know now that that's like sort of like a comedy, like it's a black comedy, but as a kid I was like, they just shot that blind woman's dog. You know, like that was really, I mean, it's very bad in a way. It's like very, very, very bad, because I do think like the violence you watch and the violence you sort of engage with art does have an effect on you. So I've always liked, I mean, and for me, so my older brothers also would get comics. This is the early 80s, the black and white boom. So I would love, they were buying all these comics, and I would go with them, and I wanted to just be like them and buy comics, but I only liked the ones that kind of looked transgressive, you know? So instead of buying like Captain America, I'd get Neil Adams, weird like guy with all these knives. It was this comic they did. So I remember buying this Neil Adams comic, like one of the first comics I ever bought. It's a superhero comic, right? He just looks like a Wolverine, Captain America sort of hybrid thing.
Oh,
Armor or something.
Armor.
So Armor.
Joe
And then
McCullough.
and it ends. The first issue ends.
You
I was
tell
6.
us about Armor.
The issue ends with the main character getting his hands cut off.
Is that right?
Yeah. And I never saw another issue, because when you're a little kid, you don't go every month. You're like, they just cut off the hero's hands, and he's tied up, and like come back next, and probably the next issue he's got both his hands back. Who knows? But I always in Dead World. I used to look at those Dead World covers by Sulu. What's his name? Anyway.
Somebody in here knows.
I thought you were going to say Vince Locke.
Vince Locke.
Oh, Vince
That's who it is.
Locke.
Vince Locke. I'm thinking of the guy who did like.
Michael Zulli sounds like.
Michael Zulli. That's right.
Michael Zulli and Vince Locke.
So Vince Locke did these Dead World comics, so my brother was into punk rock and horror movies and comics, and I always sort of just looked at them as just of a piece. That comics were transgressive. Like I would look at covers of like Von Bodie books, of like what's the wizard? What's the one with the
Cheech Wizard?
Cheech Wizard, and I was like, what? Where's the character? Like, is it the hat? Like, what? Where's his eyes? Like I would stare at this stuff. Jim Woodring, like early Jim Woodring stuff, even. Like, my brother was really, really into a lot of that stuff, and so I am attracted to it. But my attraction to it is less I don't like things that look realistic. I don't like things that are sadistic or mean. I like things that I like the artifice of movies. So like, you know, a good example is like Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, where to do an effect, he'll run the film backwards. You know, he'll have an actor painted to look like a statue that blinks. You know, like I like the handmade quality of them, and I like the willful daydream that we get into when we watch these things. You know, so that's it's purely just the visual thing. It's not the negative connotation to it. It's more, and really, if you look at a slasher movie and you break it down in the most simple way, it's this amazing thing where it'll be a point of view shot of someone roaming through a house with scary music, like usually some very abstract electronic score, and then cut to a naked girl in a shower. So right when you see that, you're like, all right, she's gonna die. And then it cuts back to the point of view and this weird music, and then it cuts back to her. And it's this long sequence where there's no intellectual content at all. It's purely just pulling what would be in a normal movie would be 10 seconds and stretching it and stretching it. And if you watch really badly, like homemade horror films by like, you know, used car salesmen who would get into the business, right? It's like these scenes, they don't know rhythm or timing, so these scenes just go on and on. Very odd. Horror movies can be really odd. But I think the imagery, some of the best imagery in film comes from horror because it's where you're seeing all kinds of very outlandish and extravagant things, and most of them are made very cheaply. So they're shot very modestly and simple. And goes back to that whole idea like of things sort of pulling back and letting sort of things play out. You know, I mean, yeah, there's guys like Cassavetes and stuff like that, but it's people like James Whale and all the Val Lewton films where you're seeing just these incredibly evocative, strong images, and it has nothing really to do with like they're about death or something. You know, I mean, I don't feel like I'm not gothy.
No. That's for sure.
I went to a Fangoria convention.
How old were you?
I went recently because I've always wanted to go.
Awesome.
And I forced my wife to come, and we had a baby, and I'm like, we're doing this. We're definitely doing this, right? So we go, and then you walk in, and you're like, oh, okay. Well, there's Jack Hill. He made a great movie called Spider Baby, so I'll get Jack Hill autograph. Like, why do I don't even care about autographs? And I have to pay for it. You're like, okay. And then you sort of get a sense of the whole vibe, and you're like, it's really not for me. Like what most of these people, I don't know if there's much overlap with what I enjoy out of these movies and what the people who come to these conventions. I felt that way at the Charlotte convention, at Heroes Con. Like I realized
about comics.
About like mainstream comic shows, just because I like to go, even though I like to go and like find old back issues of the journal and like read old things, it's like, doesn't mean those people are interested in like my work. Just because I'm interested in them, doesn't mean they're interested in me.
No, that's something we run into a lot, actually.
Which is fine. It's a good. It's just something you realize and you sort of get over.
Yeah, I mean, you might be really interested in Richard Corbin, but he does not.
He doesn't care about.
He doesn't care about you.
Yeah, and you know, that's good.
It's probably for the best.
That's why his work is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, Richard Corbin. Let's see. Well, maybe now's a decent time to talk about Kramers a little bit. I mean, sure. Kramers Ergot 8 came out about a year ago, a little less. And I mean, you occupy a funny place in comics as a cartoonist and an editor, and you were a self-publisher as well. Mm-hmm. So how's your approach to navigating all these cartoonists? And I'm almost less interested in the process of choosing everybody as I am sort of as you move through the last 10 years. And how has your perception of working with cartoonists changed, and your perception of sort of what needs to be published changed?
Maybe we've talked about this before, but I think a lot of it's trying to just stay excited and to retain enthusiasm and like just, wanting to make books that you want to see.
Right.
And especially, I mean, I don't know, I feel like me and my friends kind of root for each other. And when I see a good comic, or see a cartoonist I like, I feel like I'm rooting for him to make the right decisions and for like things to play out for them. You know what I mean? Like you want everything to go well, you know? So I think it's sort of like at this point, there is an element of like, we're gonna like gang up together and we're gonna make something.
What do you think
cool.
defined your, or our shared, but your in terms of Kramers, sort of generation of cartoonists that you've stuck with, like CF, Ben Jones, Kevin.
Like what is it about them that I keep going back to?
Well, what's the common thread? I mean, what is it that makes what is it that makes this night different from all other nights? Or this generation different than other generations?
You know what it is? I think it's irreverence. Honestly.
Irreverence?
Yeah. I think there's an irreverence to all these people.
All those people being very reverent
to
art.
I don't mean to, I feel like,
to the craft.
No, I feel like they're irreverent to like, their approach to things is very like playful and fun, and there's a sense of humor.
Right.
But at the same time, they take their work really serious, they work really hard.
Right.
There's a lot of, none of it's on the surface, I feel. I mean, it is, because it's very beautiful,
right.
But I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening that you actually need to read those comics to really get the full power of them, Right. And what's amazing about them is that those guys continually keep revealing more. As far as like, you're like, man, I know I published him 3 years ago in an issue, but this guy, he's like on a whole other level now.
Right.
And they just keep doing that, where you're like, ooh, like I really want to be a part of this. I want to contextualize it. I want to do something with it.
Right.
I don't know. It's a way of also getting excited about comics.
About making comics as well?
Yeah, I think so. There's an element to it that there's that, and it is a lot easier. As hard as it can be to edit an anthology, it is easier than having to come up with a new story sometimes.
So it can be an excuse as well.
It's like, man, I really would love to have a graphic novel. I would love to have another book. And then you go, well, I could make a book in 6 months if I just gather all these other people's work and put it together. It's just, I don't know. I don't know what the thing is, but it's just like something where I get excited.
Right.
And I feel like I try not, none of these books are a response to a previous issue. I try, because then it would just become a silly game.
Right.
And it's not about topping the last issue in any sort of way. I feel like what it is, it's almost like a diary of my interests at that time. And it would be nice to keep doing Kramers continually for a long time.
Yeah. And
sort of be able to eventually stand back and sort of track it, For me, it would be interesting.
If you got to 20 years, it would be pretty interesting.
Right.
10. Over 10.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. With that, let's open it up to questions. Anyone? Yeah.
At the beginning, you said you had a story with male characters, and you turned them female because so it wasn't you. So you want to get away from what actually happened, or autobiography. Why? What? But you said you. Do you want everyone to get away from autobiography, or do you want to?
No, it's more for me because it's not that it was. It wasn't that the characters were named. I think Do you want the long answer? Should we do the long answer?
We don't have that much time.
I'll try to make it short. But initially, basically, there's this element of, because initially, sometimes you start a story and it comes out of something that happened, or a specific experience, or a certain time in your life, and it can be hard to, when writing fiction, to sort of get past it, because you really are adhering to a certain way of thinking when it comes to the characters and where it comes to, and I realized that it was coming together, but it felt a little like it needed to be something that had more possibility. Like I needed mentally to open it up to what could happen to these people and where it took place and something like that. And by switching it, to female characters, or the two girls, all of a sudden it was like much more of a sense of discovery of who they are and what is this friendship. And of course it mirrors, you know, my own friendships or friendship with somebody. And there are definitely things that people who were around at that time can totally see. These things are very clearly autobiographical. But it just sort of gave me room to not have to adhere to a set time. Autobiography in general, you know, I've done one autobiographical strip called Lubavitch, and it takes place in 1876, right? And I'm living in the Ukraine. But it's pretty autobiographical of where I was at that time in my life. And the one thing, like when you're working on something like that, you're like, God, I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to portray myself as a sympathetic character, because it's pathetic. Like, oh, look at me, things are so sad for me. You know, like, that just seems like such a terrible thing. But then you don't want to go the opposite route and just present yourself as this sort of jerk, even though that's the easier way to go, and it can be really funny. You're just like, you want to find this weird thing. And that was like kind of a traumatic experience working on that comic, because it was like, all this, trying to like work out all this stuff that normally you don't have to deal with when you're doing fiction. And then, I mean, it's very fictional, that comic, in a lot of ways, but in some ways it's very autobiographical. And I just thought by calling the characters by my name, my wife's name, our friends, their names, you know, it was like, I felt like I had some obligation. But I think it's Robert Louis Stevenson who said, like, fiction is 90% autobiography. You know, even if it's, you know, outlandish fiction, I think you eventually make work that is your experience, you know? So, yeah.
Another question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I took a class at my university under Carol Tyler, and she made us do Kramers Ergot pages, like the front, reflective of the big ones, and I was wondering, what about that huge format attracted you to make that particular Kramers Ergot?
Okay, first, did Carol ever spin her baton for you in class?
Not for my class, no.
But she did out on the field or something?
Yeah.
Cool. We did a signing, and when she would take a break, she would just spin the baton and then get back to work. That's the 16 by 21 is the size of the original newspaper size. So I was looking at a lot of, well, Peter Maresca released this Little Nemo book. There was a Little Nemo collection where it was all really large, and I'm thinking, wow, like this strip, I've always liked it, but it sort of takes on a whole new meaning at that size. And I don't think I'd ever seen any comics that large. I'd seen like, you see images, you know, but you never really read stuff that large, you know, in like a mass-produced book. There was that, and then there was the Masters of American Cartooning show. It was traveling around, and I saw that, and so there was a lot of tear sheets, there was a lot of originals, and I just was like, you know, feeling like what was cool about it was, by working at that size, cartoonists I normally wouldn't ask to be in Kramers because they have other outlets for their work, and they don't really need to be in an anthology. This was a unique opportunity to sort of open the scope of the people I worked with, and not be so aesthetically uptight, because I usually have a very kind of clear picture of what I want with an issue. But this was like, let's just go like fairly broad, you know, and ask people, like, there's no reason to ask Jaime Hernandez to do something for an anthology because he has Love and Rockets, for example. But with something like this, it's like, Jaime, you want to do a page this big, you know, like that could be kind of interesting. And I think the book's okay, you know, I feel like it was, I mean, I hope people like it, but it was a fun project. It was like a cool thing to work on, and it was, I think it yielded some really great work, you know. Yeah, that was my thinking with that one.
Other questions? Yeah.
What do you think about like the subtext of like entertainment in comics, and if it's something that they're like meant to retain? I feel like as comics evolve, people are pushing to get them more literary and more serious. And is that something like you think should happen, or people should remember that it's like?
I'm not dogmatic in that way. I mean, I feel like people should make the work that like, you know, represents them. For me, I realize that number one, like, priority now when making a comic is that it's entertaining.
Yeah.
When you're younger, when you're in art school, you're like, I want people to know that I'm like sensitive. and I'm gonna do this adventure comic, but it's gonna be very sensitive, right? But now I'm kind of like, number one should just be entertainment. Like that's the number one thing with everything, is that it's fun and that there's like something that is engaging. And then like, if you can then sort of fold in, because there's also this thing where you don't need a panel of somebody sitting by themselves silently if you have the right kind of story, because if it's moving a certain way, it's already sad. The story is already sad if you never even bring attention to someone's sadness, you know? And I am excited by that sort of thing, because I don't see it so much, but I mean, did you read the new Love and Rockets? Have you seen that? Love and Rockets 5.
Yeah.
And there's so much energy, and there's so much going on, there's so much to track, but it's so emotionally strong. And it's strong because you're pulling it out of it. It's not laying it on a plate for you. You know, it's you're going halfway, you're sort of making it happen, you're sort of figuring out these people's emotions. And I think that's, you know, I think one of the things with comics that's cool is that it's kind of like embarrassing to read them, right? Like there's that thing still, like you can't sit on a bus and read a comic. If you try it, it's kind of a weird thing to do, you know? But it's like, that's what's kind of cool about it, because everyone's expectations are low. The last issue of my comic had a girl with her dress pulled over her head. And it was just like, it's like, yeah, it looks vulgar and it looks disgusting, you know, and I kind of want people to approach it with these really low expectations. And hopefully, even with your low expectations, it delivers on just if you want that. But it, you know, hopefully it also surprises you and sort of goes somewhere. You know, and I feel like the films and the books that I love are never things that are sort of presented in a way by even the people who make them as thinking these are great works, that are rich works. It's more like they sort of deliver on what you sort of expect, but then there's sort of these other things happening underneath, you know? I don't know, who's doing even what's a literary comic?
I have no idea.
I don't even know. I don't know what it is.
I don't think. People always talk about it.
I'm like, Chris Ware's last comic jumped a year every page.
Yeah, it's not literary.
Well, I mean, it's like, I'm just saying, it has
No,
a certain, like, oomph.
I think of Chris as being like the most avant-garde cartoonist.
Wow.
Well, because Kramers is very traditional.
Yes.
It's
Very
traditional
traditional.
cartooning. Chris is avant-garde. I don't know why.
I published Chris,
I know.
so I'm not avant-garde.
Oh, well, you know what I mean.
I don't, okay.
Well, no, think of it this way, like Johnny Ryan, traditional cartoonist.
Yeah, no,
that's,
sure.
That's just
Sure.
pacing, drawing.
I'm definitely very traditional. I like
Christopher.
stories that, like, I like the 3-act structure. I'm not interested in formalism.
Yeah.
You know, I like stories, I like characters.
And Ben Jones is a very traditional humor cartoonist.
He sometimes
At core.
forgets to draw a panel.
That's just
Leaves
process,
blank.
man. I bet E.C. Segar forgot sometimes too. One more question. Wow, we've answered everything. Oh.
Well, it was interesting to hear you say you're not interested in formalism, but a little bit earlier you were talking about putting together some of these books, and your process has elements of formalism sometimes, like drawing a thread together,
Yeah.
as opposed to like having a strict.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think formalism should be in service of a larger narrative or other ideas should be at play. You know, I sort of like things to work. You want a page to be, you want stuff to work on like a completely narrative level, and then hopefully there's like other things going on, and then formalism can be one of those concerns. You know, I mean, we were just talking about Chris Ware, so it's like a perfect example. Like when he does something formally inventive with the page, it's in service of sort of other intellectual and emotional ideas, and that formalism is the best, those formal elements are the best way to bring that up, you know? So I'm interested in that way, but, you know, there's comics, a lot of French comics, where they're just interested in like purely thinking about the mechanics, and I feel like I'm in comics school or something. You know, it's just not enough for me. It's pretentious, you know? Sorry. I don't know. I feel bad to say anything's pretentious, but.
Don't look at me.
Yeah. It's too pretentious.
Okay, on that note, thank you, Sammy. It's great.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming out.